Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy, and today I am super excited to be joined by Judge Ginger Lerner-Wren from Florida. It's very early there, and Judge Lerner-Wren got up nice and early to speak with me. Thank you, Judge Ginger Lerner-Wren.
It's my pleasure, Jane. Anything for you.
Oh, that's so nice of you to say. It's great to talk to you about mental health and your role in the establishment of America's first mental health court. But before we get into all of that, Judge Lerner-Wren, can you please tell me a little bit about yourself and your professional background and, how you developed this interest in mental health?
Absolutely. But before I do, I just want to share, what an amazing surprise to have one of my social media Twitter friends join me in Scotland, correct?
Yes, correct.
Last year when I came on that Presiding with Kindness tour, for lack of a better word, by Ian Smith, and it was just amazing to see you there and meet you in person. So I just wanted to say that, and I think that I always had a vision, Jane, of what practicing law meant for me, even when I was a little girl. And I think my goals in practicing law was really, to do it from more of a civil rights, public interest vantage point, and really focus on the human issues that intersect with the law, and really, I think, come from that, humanizing justice, focus. And when I got out of law school, I really couldn't find a fit. I was practicing law, I was doing really, well, but it just really wasn't my passion. And I stepped back for a while and really reevaluated. I even thought about leaving the law.
Okay.
And going into psychology.
Interesting.
It is. It's fascinating because I teach a master's class in forensic psychology at Nova Southeastern University and a doctoral class in criminal justice on the work that I do. But I remember, going for a meeting, and I was like young, and I remember going for a meeting with the deans over at the School of Psychology, and I said, I really want to get my doctorate. And they go, oh, no, you don't. They go,
yeah, well.
They go, look, you just got out of law school, and you're going to find your fit. If you really want to do this, think about doing something a little bit more efficient. And I have to say that I walked away in somewhat more confused, a little in despair, but I just stayed focused. I really did a lot of, reflection and inner work and manifesting, and all of a sudden, I'm not making this up, and all of a sudden, a position came open, a very unusual position. I got a tip from one of the judges at the time that there was going to be an opening in what we called our Office of Public Guardian.
Okay.
And they were looking for a new administrator. They were looking for a lead lawyer because it required a lawyer. Mm-hmm. So that not only would you be responsible for the administration of this probate court program, but then of course the probate judge, this in our state, it's a circuit judge for adults that were that needed, in our jargon, in our terminology, it's a guardian, a legal guardian. Some states call it conservatorship. Some call it trusteeship. We call it guardianship for adults. And these were adults, let's say, due to advanced age. Maybe they suffered from dementia or Alzheimer's, due to mental illness, due to neurological problems, stroke, intellectual disability, whatever. They were indigent. They had no family, so they needed a guardian to do everything. Health, safety, welfare, medical decisions, death arrangements, housing, economic benefits, abuse, neglect, advocacy, protection. And I just said, I have to have this job. I have to have this job. Yeah. And I studied and I prepared for it. I went down to meet with another program director, not the same model, but similar, shadowed that person for a day. And really, you know, when I came to the interview, I just was so prepared. And sure enough, I got the position. It was one of the greatest jobs I ever had. We had a ratio of 1 case manager to 40 clients, and we had no extra budget to expand our service reach of our program. So I decided I'll take on my own caseload of clients. And so, you know, in law, we always say, you know, it's a helping profession. We're all social workers, you know, dive right in. And I just absolutely adored that role. And I think it was also an opportunity to identify, and I think that if there's some takeaways from our talk, one of the takeaways is, you know, through collaboration and relationship building, you know, we can fill gaps in services, in resource, in policy, and it always doesn't take money. It takes collaboration. And I think one of the most exciting things about that role was building these partnerships, building these relationships, and saying, you know, I think that we could work together and we can make sure, you know, the program expands and gets these resources, which we didn't have before. And, you know, that was really wonderful. But one day, well, during a particular time, there was a kind of complicated, but ultimately it really became the trajectory of America's first mental health court. But there was a federal class action, a lawsuit, a civil rights lawsuit that was filed against our regional state psychiatric hospital that was situated in Broward County, but really served almost the bottom half of the entire state. The state of Florida is the 3rd largest state in the United States.
I didn't know that.
It's huge, it's diverse. We don't have any Medicaid expansion in the state of Florida, and we're one of the lowest funded states in mental health. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs here. The COVID virus is really exacerbating, exploiting those weaknesses in our system, I think. And so there was a move through the state government to close the state hospital during this early phase of the litigation. And I went to the state hospital to talk before a legislative policy forum, advocating not to close the hospital because we didn't have any community system of care. Most of these patients lived in that state hospital for years. their families couldn't manage them at home. And again, we just didn't have any community system. And somebody heard me speak there. And when things at the public guardian's office started to get extremely stretched in terms of resource, I had a number of family members come to me and just all said the same thing. You know, somebody said, you could help me with my mother who has schizophrenia. Somebody told me, Ginger, that you could help me with my brother, you know, with bipolar disorder. We can't find any services in Broward County, and we were told to come to you. Mm-hmm. And I remember this happened over the course of like 10 days, and I remember thinking to myself, Jane, I don't get this. They're all saying the same thing. It's uncanny.
Yeah.
It really, you know, had me thinking that maybe that was a county commissioner or somebody was referring people. I actually got in my car and drove down to the county, to the governmental offices and started asking every county commissioner, are you telling people to come? Because I can't take people with family members into my program that doesn't meet the criteria. People are leaving, they are distraught. And why isn't there any you know, I was so young.
Yeah.
You know, and learning.
Yeah.
And I remember walking.
Right. You were obviously doing something amazing that, and people were desperate and hoping that you'd have the flexibility.
Exactly. Yeah, obviously. And I remember walking that last family, you know, to the elevator in my office building next to the courthouse at the time. And I just said to myself privately, silently, if I ever get a chance to help these families, because they looked exhausted. They were fatigued from trying to find help. They were just in absolute despair and frightened. And I just said, if I can do anything to help these family members, I will. Mm-hmm. Within 3 weeks, I get a call. And it was from a lawyer, a friend of mine, who was pretty, you know, vague when he said, Ginger, listen, a job, a very responsible new mental health position just came open. And I can't tell you who, but this person thinks that you would be very good for this role. And would you be interested? And I've told this story, you know, before, and yet it always is so powerful to hear it, even when I say it out loud. Yeah. Just the synchronicity, you know, of all this. And I have a very strong view of innovation and synchronicity. And I said to myself, well, of course I'm interested. What kind of question? I made a promise to these families, and of course I'm interested. Well, P.S., within 6 months, I was the plaintiff's monitor of that federal class action. Okay. Which meant that I was literally working every day at the psychiatric hospital. I had carte blanche over that institution. I was overseeing the implementation now of a new consent decree, a settlement agreement that hadn't even been approved yet by the court. I took the job, I didn't even have a paycheck. Mm-hmm. But I knew I had to take it. And it was through this work that I was trained by an extraordinary plaintiff's expert team in this litigation. in psychiatric rehabilitation from a person first vantage point, consumer rights, systems of care, you know, case management in its most innovative form, and all of the technologies of what makes a really, really good, qualitative, individualized, person-centered discharge plan. You know, the idea of the promotion of choice and consumer rights, you know, was all bound up in my training. And when you think about, as we cross over systems, you know, going, let's say, from a community-based system now, with the intersection of criminal justice,
Yes.
you know, discharge planning out of hospitals in the community is diversion out of a court.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing. You know, we really need those same components,
Mm-hmm.
the same understanding of what is entailed, and how to manage risk,
Yes.
how to treatment match. And so I think it was a fascinating springboard, a very traumatic springboard. People go, well, how'd you do that? You know, mental health court judge, isn't it difficult? Isn't it depressing? You know, I used to get those questions all the time. When I first started the court, I said, are you kidding me? For me, after spending a year and a half in a psychiatric hospital as a plaintiff's advocate, it's so healing to be able to really now do work from a recovery community vantage point, which is so, you know, innovative. So that's kind of the background to my skill sets. A little unusual.
Pretty amazing. And I've read your book, The Court of Refuge, so I'm familiar with some of that, but you took me back. Yeah, it's an amazing book, and we'll refer to it later, Judge Lerner-Wren. But how typical do you think is that type of background, really, for someone who ends up to be a judge? You know, whether you're dealing, obviously you're in a specialized mental health court, and having spent that time in the psychiatric hospital could only be illuminating, I would imagine, and seeing the multidisciplinary working, and, you know, how it has to be, it has to really have all these component parts to work as well as it can. But do judges in America or elsewhere, do you think, have enough of these insights into other systems?
Well, they didn't then. You know, they're getting them now. I always felt, like I said, Jane, you know, some things are meant to be. I feel, you know, this was my destiny.
Yeah.
And because ironically, you know, being a monitor, I don't, you know, for those out there in forensic psychology, or lawyers and experts in the field, if you've ever worked as a monitor, and usually monitors are court-based, meaning they're fact-based, they're not advocates. This was a very controversial federal class action. It was not well embraced. And it was an extremely difficult role. About a year and a half into it, I decided, you know, that's probably, I took the role as far as I could take the role, and I decided to run for a judicial seat. As I got in unopposed 30 days before the election, our legislature and the governor at the time in 1995, so it's a while ago, funded a new judicial seat. And I had already been campaigning for over a year with these fabulous, individually wrapped, iced, spiced gingerbread cookies. They were so good. A big hit.
Right.
Big hit.
And cakes.
I know, and I won unopposed. I credit the gingerbread cookies. Yeah. And so, you know, and I hoped that all of these skill sets that you don't get in law school could and would be applied somehow when I got to the bench. And sure enough, not knowing exactly what was happening in the criminal justice sector while I was working in the civil side, they had already encountered and was working to try to respond to what we call, you know, and what we know as the problem of the criminalization of people with mental illnesses and other cognitive disorders, really just flooding our jail system in Broward County. Now, this was in 1995. I got to the bench technically in 96 because I got an unopposed, but I began on the bench in January of 1997. And there were a number of problems in our criminal justice system that a small group of lawyers and judges and community advocates like yourself identified and were looking for solutions.
Okay. And so then you ended up in the first mental health court in America. Isn't that correct, Judge Lerner-Wren? How did that come about?
It is. Well, it's a great story. Because while I was working at the state hospital, this small, diverse group of mental health and criminal justice stakeholders had literally brought two very siloed and parallel systems that never really talked to each other together. And they created a task force. And it was headed by one of our circuit judges. They would meet monthly. And their objective was, again, to try to find solutions to the deficits in our criminal justice system, which was really linked to the shortfalls of our community-based mental health system of care, which just a couple of years, or actually just around the time that the task force started, a grand jury had been impaneled to investigate Broward County's mental health system, and in 1994 issued a scathing grand jury report. It was a 153-page grand jury report looking and investigating all of our facets of our mental health system and finding that our system was deplorable. And that's not my words, that's the grand jury's words. And that in terms of all their recommendations, just making a finding that there was no one accountable to anyone for anything. So now it answered my question, why were those families coming to me in such despair? I got it, connected the dots. The mental health court is really an outgrowth of that grand jury report and the work of a very courageous community task force that after several years of meeting could not reach consensus as to what to do. They didn't have any grants, they had no funding, and yet they knew now that they had a young judge coming with special skill sets. And our public defender at the time, who was on the task force, in a moment of frustration, just said, you know, I want my own bleeping court.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that they really knew what the court was going to look like or how it was going to function. But there was a model of sorts in America at the time with our first treatment-oriented drug court.
Okay.
And so building on the problem-solving court model, they just kind of did a Hail Mary and said, we want our own court, we've got a judge, we know what she's going to do. And 6 months later, I found out what I was going to do.
Yeah, you learned as you went along.
When I got the call.
Yeah. And so what then have you found in your years presiding over this mental health court about the intersection between mental health problems and offending behavior, Judge Lerner-Wren?
You know, I think it's astounding, you know, when you integrate, you know, first of all, the research. I mean, we could take this from so many different levels, but first I'll take it from, I think, from the research base. Because judges like research and experts like research, and I do too. You know, so when we look at the data and the research having to do with prevalence, let's just start with prevalence. Mm-hmm. You know, in the UK, it's 1 in 4 suffer, you know, people, adults suffer from some kind of mental health condition. In the United States, it's 1 in 5. Mm-hmm. We know the cascading consequences and impact of untreated or undertreated mental illness. And that's everything from health erosion to family erosion, right? Family problems. People lose their jobs. It's hard to talk about that right now during this pandemic, but you know, it's true. And people end up becoming homeless without mental health care. You know, oftentimes people seek relief through drugs and alcohol, through substance. So now you have addictive disorders. Mm-hmm. They begin the cycling of incarceration and homelessness, crisis in emergency rooms, cycling back into jail systems, back into emergency rooms or crisis centers. And the worst impact of all, of course, is suicide and other kinds of victimization. But so we know that data. I know as a mental health, you know, advocate, and as a PAMI lawyer, because I am a civil rights, disability rights lawyer, mm-hmm. Treatment works. I have an abiding belief in recovery, get well, mm-hmm. Go back to work, relationships, college, community engagement, right? Reach your dreams. And so if you know, we know the prevalence, so we know so many people are entering the criminal justice system. And when I say that, I'm talking about the juvenile justice system. So we know that women suffer differently than men in a lot of ways because of the exposure to trauma. You and I have talked about that over Twitter and in person, and we are so knowledgeable and I think insightful and that conscious, I think is the word, of women that, you know, they might not be aware of the impact of adverse childhood experiences or exposure to trauma and victimization And so if they're suffering from depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then they try to find personal solutions through relationship. Oh, this guy, I'll get into a relationship, I'll be fine. I'll use substance that, I can't. And then, of course, it becomes a snowball effect that without psychotherapeutic intervention, and a trauma-informed approach, women, 95% of women, justice-involved women, have had some kind of experience, some kind of victimization.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that, and of course, if we overlay, now what I would say is, we didn't really talk about social determinants of health in the beginning of the court, but several years ago, as we're really starting, as the research and I think dialogues in public health are really more focused on the overarching scheme of poverty. Mm-hmm. And all of those social determinants and social conditions that impact disparities, that underscore disparities. And really, isn't the criminal justice system about disparity?
Massively, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Racial injustice in the United States, toxic stress, the impact of poverty, not having access to quality education. Vast majority of youth and adults have not graduated from high school. Their functional illiteracy is a huge problem. And so, all of these conditions, we can go on and on, but I think we get the idea that, poverty and all of these other disparities in education and health and employment, not having an upward economic ladder, is really underscores the root causes of these drivers into the justice system. And then when we intersect, of course, all the mental health components, it's everybody. It's everybody.
It is. During our conversation in Edinburgh, I remember we both were thrilled when we agreed that mental health is health. We have this sort of binary approach to them, like they're not at all connected. Whereas, as Dr. Stephen Porges says, like stress and trauma, an overdose of stress sets down the neural platforms for disease and mental health problems. So if we're not safe in our bodies from the time of birth onwards, is it any wonder that when we're poor and subject to racial abuse and can't focus, that we just develop maladaptive coping strategies, and some of that can include self-harm or suicidality and all the rest. How do you then, as a judge in the mental health court, engage with information, I suppose? Do you seek information on people's life histories, or do some of the other maybe specialist providers in your court elicit this information? I mean, is the court trauma informed, for example?
It is, and when I first thought about, well, okay, get the call, Ginger, when do you want to start your new mental health? And I thought the chief judge, who's very conservative, Jane, I actually thought he might change his mind. That's what I was worried about. I wasn't worried about doing the court. I was thrilled. I said, oh, could I have 10 days? I'll fly. I'll paint the jet in midair.
Yeah.
And so, we talk about this power of relationship and power of collaboration, going back to my opening remarks. And I called my friends and I said, hey, could you come to my office? We have to chart out not only the mechanics of the design mechanics of how are we going to actually activate this court from a diversion vantage point, then we have to deal with leading that vision across all of these providers and agencies and sectors, and get the transportation right and all of those complexities. But I thought, first and foremost, philosophically, if I'm going to communicate what this court is going to do, and if I didn't even know if it was going to work. Like, what if I could get people out of jail? What if the transportation piece, we had no money. What if people didn't want to help me? And
right.
I was depending on all of these agencies that, you could have a client today in the community, but when they're in jail, they're not your client anymore.
Sure. The silo mentality.
Yeah, even mental health agencies were siloed. They're silos within silos. I was asking every agency to break down and realign their service models for no money. Luckily, we had, some really great advocacy through this task force and a great shared vision. But this leadership, we talk about, first and foremost, the leadership model had to be perfect. And before you can lead, you really have to know how you're going to communicate your campaign. It's not gingerbread cookies anymore.
No.
And I really needed to make sure that my values were well understood, what we were going to do, why we were doing it, how we're going to communicate the vision. And first and foremost, like you said, Jane, we recognized as a community, we can't do business like this anymore. That we cannot be enablers of an injustice knowingly. Now that we're conscious, now that we're enlightened, our community made a bold decision. And when I say community, I'm not talking about hundreds and hundreds of people. I'm talking about a small group.
Right.
That were bold enough to say, now that we have a structure that we believe could make a difference, this innovation, we're going to back it up. And we are going to say, whether it works or whether it doesn't work, we now have a judge that is going to let these family members know they are not alone. They have a judge that understands and gets it, that we're not going to participate in this conveyor belt of incarceration of people with mental illness. We're not going to wink and nod at hearings. We're not going to make fun of them behind their backs. I knew that dignity needed to be the centerpiece of the court. I knew that the court was a human rights effort. That was as a result, and it's all in the book, about a high-profile case that really, this one defendant was the catalyst for the court. And so we knew that we also had the problem-solving court model that we could now had permission, that we can take therapeutic jurisprudence, this beautiful, beautiful law reform science, TJ we call it in the field, that says we could bend court process to humanize it. We could soften court process to allow storytelling. If we're not having trials in a treatment court, what's the harm in people sharing their stories?
Sure.
We want to build trust. We want to build connectivity. I recognize that we're dealing with the most, really, so people have so much shame, stigma, marginalization, dehumanization. So my goal, if nothing else, even if the court didn't work fundamentally, I could convey respect and dignity and caring and compassion. How do I do that as a judge? I just told them, this court is here for you.
Nice.
We are here for you. And we're here to serve you. So how can we help you? And that's literally how we started court. You know, informed consent, protection of constitutional rights. Everybody got appointed a public defender. Everybody got a lawyer. I embedded a clinician that I handpicked from the state hospital into the courtroom. I didn't want screenings to be done out of sight and out of mind. I wanted to bring our fight, as Mental Health America says, out into the open so that people understood that this is so prevalent, and the pain, the sorrow, but also the joy.
Sure.
The joy of somebody going, oh my gosh, Judge, I feel so much better. I went back to college, I got a job, I went home, you know, life begins again. And so the hierarchy of the values of the court, dignity is running through a pillar of every facet of the court, from language, trauma-informed, right? Throughout the entire process, dignity is paramount, just as public safety is, just as the protection and preservation of constitutional rights are, and the idea, as you said, that the courtroom needs to become a classroom so that I could braid the evidence base into the court process and teach as we go.
On that, if I recall correctly in the book, you sometimes bring the adverse childhood experience science to the attention of the people in the courts to kind of tell them this is what the CDC found once they surveyed all these 17,000 mainly white middle class people with health insurance, that adverse experiences in childhood are common and they have a cumulative effect and can cause mental health problems. They can increase suicide risk of violence, perpetration and victimhood, risk of drug addiction and the like.
Yeah, and medical problems. Yeah, God, you know, God bless Dr. Felitti, Dr. Andre, Kaiser Permanente in California. You know, and the CDC, you know, for bringing forward what even to this day is probably one of the most important research projects ever done. It tells us not only about these, you know, 10, sometimes people say 12, you know, ACE events, but what is the implication, you know, not only in terms of our medical health conditions, but our negative social consequences. And negative social consequences, substance use, incarceration, risky behavior, et cetera, and, you know, to be able to talk about, you know, the ACE study in court, and I really started doing that largely with the help of Dr. Lenore Walker, who is a dear friend and former director of the forensic psychology program at Nova Southeastern University. She just recently retired.
Okay.
But her claim to fame is being the pioneer of the battered women syndrome. And so, you know, together we really wanted to do just a women's mental health court,
right.
But we couldn't get the prisoner movement right. We couldn't, it was too complex. But, you know, for the women, not that men don't have exposure to trauma, we know they do, but women's relational pathways are so different that I really wanted them to understand that what happened to us, all of us, as children, as teens, follows us if we don't really intervene in a therapeutic way. That we could try to find these fixes, but the fixes, these band-aids, make things worse. So these dialogues in court have been, I think, one of the greatest experiences for me, because we want to hear. And we don't say, oh, this happened to you. We just say, look, let me tell you about the research.
Yeah.
And then when they hear it, it's like, you know, you're on an Oprah show.
Yeah.
You know, it's like,
a massive light bulb, I imagine.
Yeah, you know, you have those aha moments, and you can see the light bulbs come on, and all of a sudden, women sit up and sit up straighter in their chairs.
Because they're not broken, or it's kind of normal, predictable responses to what happened.
And they go, oh,
yeah,
oh my gosh.
And it can be different.
I get it. And now you have the power, the personal capacity to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going down a blind road anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, if I could just find the right boyfriend.
Yeah.
And, you know, just do this, or look pretty enough, or do the right hairstyle. I mean, you know how that goes.
Mm-hmm.
So now it is within their own empowerment to really recover, and you can heal from trauma. And I make sure they know that. So it's exciting. It's breathtakingly exciting.
And so then, in terms of recovery and treatment within the court, is it flexible? So I presume it's not just necessarily a pharmaceutical model, you know, medication model, maybe some therapies, talk therapies, or that type of thing.
It's really, you know, it's highly individualized. And again, you know, I recruited my clinician. Her name is Janice Blendon. She's in the book too. Mm-hmm. We've traveled all over the world. I'm sorry she didn't come to Scotland with me. You would have met her. And I picked her. She worked at the state hospital when I was doing my work, and I just saw her as such a guiding, you know, she was just such a force of light, and she was so humanistic. I said, well, if I'm gonna do this court, I want the best. And she just was, in my view, the best. And she's now been with me for 23 years, therapeutically guiding this court. This is a part-time voluntary problem-solving court. I have a regular traditional criminal division, and yet the work that we do therapeutically through TJ, and restoratively through a restorative justice approach, you know, certainly carries over into my regular division, because I don't want to not give the parties in my regular division that same benefit.
Sure.
You know, if they want to take it, the lawyers know they have choices. They could choose a litigative path, but if they want to take a therapeutic path, they can do that at some point as well.
Excellent. And so I'm wondering, from all this wealth of experience that you've amassed in both courts, but like you say, you can't just switch on the knowledge about trauma and adversity and how they have an impact on people, even who may not display mental health problems per se in the regular court. Do you think that judges and lawyers would benefit from training about these matters? You know, whether it's
they do. They do, and they have. In the United States, I'm not bragging, but in the United States, we've got thousands of problem-solving courts now.
Okay.
We've got, the mental health, we've got, from the drug courts to, domestic violence courts, which are a little bit more accountable, but they are still, therapeutically guided. Through now we have veterans courts, we've got behavioral health courts, we've got girls courts, safe baby courts, dealing with the opioid crisis on the civil side. We've got juvenile mental health courts, juvenile behavioral health courts, youth courts, teen courts, you name it, we got it. And why? Because we talked in Scotland about smart justice. And this is smart justice in the sense that we can save money, we could help restore lives, we could help restore communities, we could we could reduce recidivism, we can save money. Yes, it costs money for treatment, but how much does it cost exponentially when everybody's revolving? Through hospitals and jails and blah, 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 and the impact of lost productivity in the United States. I think that the data is like $192 billion. I mean, it's massive when we look at the return on investment.
Sure.
And it gives judges, now it's true, these types of courts are not for everybody. A lot of judges are going, I'm not a social worker.
Right.
I'm a judge.
They're bad people, good people.
It's like, it's just style. It's just philosophy. It's, what's a proper role, for you as a judge, but for the judges and the lawyers that appreciate this work, like to practice this work, find self-fulfillment, it's really, really gratifying to be able to make this kind of impact through the law versus simply being, I don't mean simply, but the traditional role of a judge, more mechanical, more objective, everybody's
more rational as well,
exactly. You can't show your feelings, you can't show your vulnerabilities, your authenticity. You're really not necessarily so focused on your social emotive skill sets. You're really following, the rule of law and the process, very process over person. I think problem solving courts, largely person coexisting with process.
And so, Judge Lerner-Wren, I'm conscious of time, but this whole series has been kind of oriented to looking at how to talk policy and influence people. And you've obviously been very influential because the mental health court model has expanded elsewhere. You go around the world talking about the work that you do. Have you engaged over the years much in the policy making process in Florida and more widely in the United States?
I have, in a lot of different contexts. These problem-solving courts historically were what you would call ground up. They were grassroots. These are communities, right? You never underestimate the power of a community to
Never.
change, right? We've seen what's happening, with Suzanne and all the ACEs connection around the world. And so, but within 18 months, there were congressmen out of Ohio at the time, Congressman Ted Strickland, and now Governor DeWine, who was a senator out of Ohio. We see Governor DeWine in the United States leading Ohio very soundly through the COVID-19 pandemic. They wanted to use Broward's model to pilot mental health courts across the United States through Congress. So in 2000, legislation was passed, the American Law Enforcement Mental Health Project, with Broward's mental health court, and then a second mental health court out of King County, Seattle, which led, you know, to the emergence of these courts. And then I did a U.S. Department of Justice tour along with our CIT law enforcement pioneer, Sam Cochran, and CIT, you know, really going around the country talking to policymakers and stakeholders, in the sense that they wanted to know, you know, how does it work? What's the impact? What's the data? How do we establish this if we do want to lead change, and all of the mechanics of that. So, you know, now you have a lot of states passing legislation now from a state legislative body, so going statewide. That's a little bit of a different policy angle. With that kind of a policy dynamic, you don't get quite as much discretion, circuit by circuit. Sometimes there's really a lot of criteria built into the legislation. So I'm kind of grateful that I have that more flexibility. I don't have any standardized timelines.
Mm-hmm.
In my court, I really want to move people away from the criminal justice system as effectively as I can.
Mm-hmm.
Because why? Health is health. If people are engaged, if we were able to help them link with care, if we were able to expand access to care, and if we were able to support people and their families through engagement, and now there's no public safety risk and everything is good, and they're going solo like anybody else activating their own health, why do they need me?
Mm-hmm.
Why do I need to burden them?
Sure.
So in balance, I like the idea of using the court as limited as I can, again, using a human rights framework. Some courts require a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of conditions, there's graduations, which are good, but a lot of people don't get there because of the burden.
Right.
And these conditions. So I think there's a balancing that really needs to be looked at
Mm-hmm.
when communities or circuits or jurisdictions are doing these courts.
Final question, Judge Lerner-Wren. Ireland, the Republic of Ireland at any rate, does not yet have a mental health court. There is one now, I believe, in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. We do have a kind of a drugs court that has operated as a pilot for a very long time. I don't know how effective it is, but from your experience, would you recommend that we implement
I did. I was invited to the National Disability Authority of Ireland. I gave a keynote address in Ireland in 2009.
Okay.
It seemed at the time that that there was a lot of interest in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, of starting mental health courts. I don't exactly know what happened. Subsequent, it didn't really gain traction legislatively, but there was interest. I can say, that timing matters.
Mm-hmm.
How you lead change matters. There's an evidence base that we followed that I teach in my classes for leading change. It's called the leading change theory. I borrowed it out of corporate management theory, but it just so happens that was the process that Broward County used, and it's called the Cotter 8-step leading change theory. And we actually just blindly followed every single step of that evidence-based change theory. And I think that that's a great guide. I teach it. You can look it up. It's a global model. Professor John Connor from Harvard retired, several years ago, and yet that theory, in my view, lives on.
And it worked for you guys.
We actually didn't know that we had followed this theory, but when I was reading about it, I go, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. That somehow, again, we were fortunate enough to figure out how to logically move this through, but the task force, the high-powered task force that everybody was of like mind, the shared vision, the idea of raising the sense of urgency. If you don't have a sense of urgency, nothing happens. How you define the problem, how you really have your vision so honed, and then the idea of really, having high influencers on this task force, and being able, I think, to get small wins, get those points on the board, and then just go from there. And, I really believe that it's effective, it works, it does take, individuals with that passion and ability to articulate a sense of urgency, which, you could get your social media and your journalists involved in this process, and really come out in a very powerful way. And ultimately, fingers crossed, policymakers go, let's give it a try.
Speaking of urgency, the COVID-19 crisis has shown us what can be done. When our feet are to the fire, we can come up with creative solutions. And before we started, you mentioned how you've adapted your practice in the last few weeks.
We did.
Do you want to say one or two things just before we finish up on that?
I will. I want to say one other thing too, Jane. The COVID virus, we know, we're reading a lot of what's happening, with the research. From a mental health, and I just did a blog, mental health now is taking on a new crisis dynamic. It's a global crisis. It's not just about therapy anymore. It's about mental health crisis management. Crisis management, Dr. Lloyd Sutter of New York just wrote a beautiful piece on that. He, led New York, through so many different events. And so I just wanted to say we have to prepare ourselves for that. And, one thing that we were doing, as you mentioned, in Broward County, is with the court closure, the mental health court isn't up and running anymore, but I was fortunate enough to be invited in to our first appearance bond court. I am supporting another judge. We have 2 judges now in that Zoom court. I say, I'm not leading the court, but when somebody comes up with a mental health problem, who may need a hospital, may need some types of interventions, I'm there to support that court process. It has been a really, really fascinating collaborative judicial experience. And I think to the betterment of our jail system, certainly to the betterment of the people that are getting arrested, that if I can get them out of jail, out of an environment where the virus, can be so infectious, that's our goal, is to try to decarcerate as much as we can. So it's been a real innovation through crisis.
And the bond court is about granting bail, isn't it? Where
it is. We, you know, within 24 hours, somebody, if they have not, in the United States, if they have not, we have bail, we have monetary bonds, release bonds. If they have not bonded out, it's for the judge to make certain findings and hopefully help people get out of jail.
Okay, Judge Ginger Lerner-Wren, you have been magnificent. Thank you so much for the work that you've done so far, and that you will continue to do. It has been a pleasure talking to you about mental health and the mental health court for this special How to Talk Policy and Influence series. I'm very grateful. It's been a delight.
Take care. Be well. We'll talk soon.